Hey, and welcome, gurus, to this demo lesson, Virtual Network NAT. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at ACG, and it's in this lesson that we're going to talk about our case study scenario to help us understand what we are going to see once we set up this environment in our Azure Cloud Sandbox. And then we're going to go through the demonstration steps that we'll take to set up a NAT gateway for our virtual network and how we're going to check that it's working. And then we'll bring it back to the slides for some key takeaways. So for our Control-Alt-Suites organization, what we're going to have is a virtual network, and this is going to be our all too familiar Hub virtual network, and inside of it, we're going to have an Azure Bastion resource so that we can access this private resource inside of that virtual network that is contained within our subnet, and it's going to be a virtual machine that does not have a public IP, and that's why we're using the Azure Bastion. Now, as always, the setup is available in the resources of this lesson, so make sure to reference that so that you can set up your demo environment. The steps that we're going to take to complete this demonstration are we're first going to create our NAT gateway. We're going to check the public IP via the VM, and we're going to configure a public IP or public IP prefix for a NAT gateway. So this is going to help us understand what the ephemeral public IP is for our VM before we create the NAT gateway and associate it with our subnet. And then once we associate that NAT gateway with our subnet, it's going to impact that outbound traffic for a virtual machine. And after a few minutes, we'll see that we'll be able to check the public IP for our VM and verify that the NAT gateway public IP is now being used for snatting those outbound connections. All right, gurus, that's enough time in the slides. Let's make our way into the Azure portal and get started. All right, gurus, here we are inside of the Azure portal, inside of our sandbox. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is go to the resources of our lesson, get our demo setup file, copy it, bring it down to the Cloud Shell, paste it in, and this is going to prompt us to provide a username for that virtual machine. So we'll provide that, and then we'll provide our password here. Once you got your password in, it's going to ask you to enter a SAS token. We don't have one here, so we'll just hit enter. And this is going to go off and deploy all the resources that we need to participate in this demonstration. So we'll be back in about 10 to 15 minutes once this is done. All right, gurus, so we're back and our resources have finished provisioning. So we'll minimize our Cloud Shell here. We'll take a look at our resources. We see our resources have been provisioned in West US. We have that Hub virtual network and we have that Hub VM. And this is the VM that we're going to impact for using that NAT gateway. So what we're going to want to do first is we're going to use this VM's Bastion to connect to it, and we're going to check to see where it's going to send its traffic outbound. Now, it doesn't have a public IP address, so it's going to use that ephemeral IP. So we'll open up our Bastion here, and we'll put in our username and our password. And once you've got that information in, you'll be able to select Connect, and it's going to open up your Bastion in a new browser tab. And if it prompts you to allow the clipboard, just click allow, and this is so that you can copy and paste things back and forth bidirectionally. And we'll, at this point, type in clear and hit enter to clear up our display here. And then we're going to paste in this command that we have here. And I'll put the resources link to this that shows how to use this command to get your public IP address. We'll paste it in, hit enter, and what we see is it has returned the public IP that's used as our ephemeral IP for getting outbound traffic from this VM. Again, we can't reach this VM via a public IP address, but it's using this public IP that's ephemeral to get out. All right, now that we've shown that, we'll clear up our display again, and then we're going to go back to the portal here. We're going to go to the search bar. We're going to type in NAT gateways. We'll select it under services, and we're going to click create here. Now we're going to provision this NAT gateway by selecting our resource group. We're going to give it a name. We're going to call it our ACG demo NAT gateway. And then we're going to put it inside of West US so that it's inside of the same region. And if we had availability zone support for this location, we would be able to select those availability zones. And that's what we were talking about in a previous lesson with the diagrams, so that we could put them in the same AZ as, say, for example, virtual machines, if the virtual machines were deployed in such a way. We'll click next into outbound IP, and here we can choose to create a public IP address or a prefix. We're going to use a public IP here, and we're going to call this our ACG demo NAT gateway pip, and we see it's going to create it as standard and static. We'll click OK, and then we'll click next into subnet. Now this is where we're going to choose the subnets that will be impacted. We chose to deploy it in the West US region so we could associate it with the KCUP VNet. And then we see the subnets that we can apply it to. We'll select our sub 1 here, and we'll click review and create. And then once it validates, we're going to click create, and this resource is going to get provisioned. So we'll be back once this is done. All right, gurus, so we're back, and our NAT gateway resource has finished deploying. So we'll go to our resource group here, and we're going to click on our NAT gateway. And if we click on the outbound IP under settings here, we see our outbound IP address for our NAT gateway. And because we've associated this with our subnet where our virtual machine exists, what we should see when we rerun this command in the Bastion tab is this IP address. So if we come up to our Bastion tab here and we paste in that command again, we see 52.238.31.74. And here we have 52.238.31.74. So we are successfully sending our outbound traffic to be snatted via this NAT gateway. All right, gurus, that wraps up this demonstration. Let's make our way back to the slides for some key takeaways. All right, gurus, congratulations on following along in the demonstration and implementing a virtual network NAT gateway. Now, for our key takeaways here, we're going to ask ourselves, why would we choose NAT gateway? Well, we're using it for snatting our outbound connections. And we would use it to do this and to split up the traffic for inbound and outbound traffic. So not everything is going over just that one public IP address resource. And this allows us to control how we're snatting that traffic over the NAT gateway's public IP or public IP prefixes. And by doing this, also, we get dynamic port address translation for our traffic, which helps us avoid that port exhaustion that we talked about. If you remember from our table, we're able to take that traffic and map our private traffic and port to a public IP and port. And then this traffic is sent outbound via our NAT gateway using a public IP import to whatever destination that we're reaching out to. All right, gurus, that completes this demo lesson. Thanks so much for joining me in this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.